A train pulls into a small Dutch station on a grey morning, and the unloading begins. 59 freight cars. Crate after crate comes off. Oak furniture, boxes of silver, oil paintings in their frames, a writing desk, a motor car. It takes days. The man it all belongs to is 51 years old, and a few weeks earlier he had governed an empire. Now he has a country house and a fence around it. On the morning of the 10th of November 1918, Wilhelm II crossed into the Netherlands aboard his imperial train. He was the German emperor and king of Prussia, and he was running. Behind him, sailors had mutinied, crowds had filled the streets, and his own generals had told him plainly that the army would no longer march on his word. For days he had lingered at military headquarters in Belgium, imagining he might lead his soldiers home and crush the revolution himself. The soldiers had other plans, so he made for the nearest neutral country, reached a quiet border station at 6 in the morning, and asked the Dutch for asylum. The crossing itself was almost shabby. He waited hours at the frontier in his train while Dutch officials, caught unprepared, worked out what to do with a head of state who had arrived without warning. They sent him first to a nobleman's castle at Amerongen, the home of a Dutch count. He stayed there for a year and a half, a guest in another family's house, until Doorn was bought and made ready. 18 days after the crossing, on the 28th of November, he put the abdication in writing. A family that had ruled Brandenburg and Prussia for some 500 years was finished as a reigning house, and almost no blood was spilled to end it. The man who would soon fill 59 freight cars with the contents of his palaces was, that morning, a fugitive with a single train. He had surrendered the throne in a matter of days, and then he, and his heirs after him, would spend the next 100 years refusing to treat the loss as final. Wilhelm was not the only crown to fall that month. Across Germany, more than a score of kings, grand dukes and princes lost their thrones in a matter of days, from the King of Bavaria to the smallest duchy. None of them lost their lives. Most signed away their titles, kept much of their private wealth, and withdrew to their estates to wait. The revolution toppled its monarchs, and then, almost politely, let them keep the furniture. Thrones were gone. The fortunes, for now, were not. The Allies wanted him put on trial. The peace treaty had named him directly. It called for a special tribunal to try the former Kaiser for offences against international morality, and in January 1920, his name headed a published list of war criminals. The young Dutch queen, Wilhelmina, refused to surrender him. She would not break the right of asylum to please the victors, and the refusal strained her country's standing for years. The other governments soon lost their appetite for a trial, and it quietly died. So Wilhelm stayed. He bought a manor house at Doorn near Utrecht, and in May 1920 he moved in for what became the rest of his life. This is when the freight cars came. 59 of them carried furniture, silver, porcelain, books and paintings out of the Berlin palaces, across the border, and into a country house with 24 rooms. A Dutch village of a few thousand people now had a deposed emperor for a neighbour, his gateposts watched by police, his garden screened by a fence. The locals learned to live beside a court that no longer ruled anything. The furniture was only the first sign of what the family believed about its own future. At Doorn, he rebuilt the smallest possible version of the world he had lost. Footmen still served at table, guests were received by rank, and the day ran to an imperial timetable. His second wife pressed his case wherever she could, certain that Germany would tire of the Republic and call the monarchy back. To the household, the exile was a pause, never an ending. The chairs from Berlin had been shipped for a reign they expected to resume. The terms of that exile were narrow. He could not travel far from the house, he was barred from making political statements, and his letters were opened and read. To fill the empty days, he took up the axe. The former supreme warlord of Imperial Germany now spent his afternoons chopping wood in the garden, stacking logs in rows by the thousand, while Europe rearranged itself without him. He kept it up for 20 years. The private losses came fast. In 1920, his youngest son, Joachim, took his own life. He had come back from the war to a country with no court left to give him a role. The following year, the wife who had borne his 7 children and followed him into exile died at Doorn. He married again in 1922 to the princess who shared his conviction that the family would one day be summoned home. No summons arrived. What arrived instead, back in Germany, was a public argument about who actually owned the palaces he had emptied. The argument had a simple root. When Wilhelm fled in 1918, nobody had settled where his family's property ended and the state's began. The palaces, the art, the hunting estates, the bank accounts, some of it was plainly private, some plainly belonged to the crown as an institution, and a great deal sat in between. Through the early 1920s, the German states negotiated quietly with their former ruling houses over who kept what. Then, late in 1925, the terms of the Prussian deal leaked. The state had agreed to hand the Hohenzollerns a fortune in palaces and cash, and when Germans saw the figures, they were furious. Wilhelm and his relatives had the law on their side. The Republic's own constitution protected private property and said that anything taken for public use had to be paid for. The judges who heard these cases had mostly been trained under the empire, and they tended to read the dynasty's claims generously. Several former ruling houses had already gone to court and won, walking away with estates the new state could barely afford. The legal road ran one way only, toward the princes. That was why the left reached for a weapon the courts could not block: a direct vote of the people. The anger found a channel fast. The communists launched a petition to take the former royals' property outright, with no payment at all, behind a slogan that fit on a poster: "Not a single penny for the princes." The Social Democrats hesitated, then joined them. It became a rare moment of unity on the German left, and it pulled in people well beyond it: Catholic voters, liberals, even conservatives who thought the dynasties were asking for far too much. The petition cleared its threshold with room to spare. By the summer of 1926, the question would be put to every adult in the country. The campaign that followed was ferocious. Posters went up across Germany showing fat, bemedaled princes stuffing their pockets, while ordinary families went without. The churches reminded their congregations that taking property without payment broke the commandment against theft. President Hindenburg, the aging field marshal at the head of the Republic, came out privately against the measure and lent the princes the weight of his name. The dynasties spent freely to defeat it. They won not by changing minds, but by keeping enough people away from the polls. They voted on the 20th of June 1926. Close to 15.5 million Germans went to the polls, and almost 14.5 million of them voted to strip the princes of their property. It was a crushing majority of those who turned out. But the measure would change the constitution, so it needed more than a majority. It needed the backing of half the entire electorate, around 20 million votes, and turnout stalled at 39%. The proposal failed on the arithmetic. Wilhelm, reading the result at Doorn, is reported to have remarked only that there were 14 million scoundrels in Germany. To grasp what the anger was made of, take one man. Maximilian Bern was an elderly Berlin writer who had saved 100,000 marks, once enough for a comfortable retirement. In the autumn of 1923, he drew out the whole sum, and it bought exactly one thing: a single underground ticket. He rode the U-Bahn one last time around the city, went home, and died within weeks, too poor to feed himself. Bern did not live to cast a vote on any of this, but millions who had suffered smaller versions of the same ruin did. They had watched their own savings melt away, while the men who had led Germany into the war kept their castles intact. The idea that a deposed emperor should now be paid a fortune from the public purse struck them as obscene. The vote failed, but the 14.5 million people behind it did not disappear. They had told the young republic exactly what they thought of its former rulers. While his grandfather fought to keep the palaces, one young Hohenzollern wanted as far from all of it as he could get. Louis Ferdinand was a grandson of the Kaiser. He had no patience for the family's dream of restoration. He would matter all the same, because one day he would inherit not a throne, but the ruins of the family's claim to one. After finishing a doctorate in 1929, he crossed the Atlantic and did what no Prussian prince was meant to do. He went to work. In America, he took a job with the Ford Motor Company and spent time on the assembly line, learning the business from the floor up. He befriended Henry Ford himself, stayed at the industrialist's estate near Detroit, and moved through a country that did not care that his great-grandfather had been a king. He flew aeroplanes, mixed with film stars, and talked engineering with the man who had put America on wheels. He liked the informality of it. Years later, he would say that if Germany ever brought back its monarchy, he wanted a modest one, a bicycle monarchy, like the kings of Scandinavia who rode through their own capitals without ceremony. It was about as far from his grandfather's court at Doorn as a Hohenzollern could travel. But Louis Ferdinand was not the heir. He was not the one the dynasty was counting on. That was his father, the former crown prince. While his son learned to build motor cars in America, the crown prince had settled on a faster road back to the throne than any vote could offer. That road ran through Berlin. Crown Prince Wilhelm, the eldest son of the exiled Kaiser, had come home to Germany in 1923 after giving the Republic his word that he would stay out of politics. He broke it almost at once. He settled into a palace at Potsdam, kept company with the nationalist right, and waited for the Republic to fail. His father still believed the throne would one day be handed back by a grateful nation. The Crown Prince had no such patience. He thought the monarchy would have to be carried back on the shoulders of whatever strongman could break the system that had unseated his family. By the early 1930s, the Crown Prince had found his strongman. He admired the fascist regime in Italy, drifted through the veterans' leagues of the hard right, and convinced himself that Adolf Hitler, once handed power, would crown a Hohenzollern in gratitude. He even toyed with running for president himself in 1932, until his father forbade it from Doorn. So he threw his name and his prestige behind the Nazi cause instead. A prince openly backing Hitler was worth more to the movement than any ordinary endorsement. The bet seemed to pay off on the 21st of March 1933. Hitler had been Chancellor for under 2 months. To reassure the old conservative Germany that he was one of them, the regime staged a ceremony at the garrison church in Potsdam, the spiritual home of the Prussian crown. The Crown Prince was given the place of honor, in full imperial uniform, seated beside an empty chair left symbolically for his exiled father. President Hindenburg was there in his field marshal's dress. When Hitler entered the church, he crossed to the old field marshal and bowed. To the watching crowds, it looked like the new Germany kneeling before the old, and to the Crown Prince, it looked like the first step home. The men of the empire, the officers, the aristocrats, the monarchists, saw one of their own honored at the center of the new order and concluded that Hitler could be managed and used. They had it exactly backwards. He took the prestige the Hohenzollerns lent him that day and gave them nothing in return but the photographs. There would be no coronation. Once Hitler had used the conservatives to climb into power, he had no further need of them, and certainly no intention of sharing a throne with a Hohenzollern. The promised restoration was never seriously on the table. It had been bait, and the Crown Prince had swallowed it whole. As the regime showed what it was, turning on its own allies and ruling by fear, the relationship cooled. The prince who had dreamed of a crown withdrew from politics, discredited, and the dream of restoration went with him. At dawn, the old Kaiser watched the new regime with deepening distaste. He had no love for the Republic, but he trusted Hitler even less, and he said openly that Germany had ceased to live under the rule of law. In 1940, German armies overran the Netherlands, and the exiled emperor found himself living under the control of the country he had abdicated. Some suggested he leave for Britain. He refused to run a second time. His distaste had limits, though. After German forces defeated France that same year, his second wife pressed him into sending Hitler a telegram of congratulation. It was a small thing the Dutch never forgave, and after the war it helped cost the family its property in the Netherlands. He did not live to see the war's end. On the 4th of June 1941, at the age of 82, Wilhelm II died at Doorn, in the country that had sheltered him for 23 years. Hitler wanted the body brought to Berlin for a grand state funeral, a chance to wrap the new regime in the prestige of the old empire. He was denied even that. Wilhelm's will had set a single condition for his return to Germany, that the monarchy be restored first. It never was. So the last German emperor was buried where he had died, in a mausoleum in the grounds at Doorn. He lies in that Dutch village still, more than 80 years later. A German monarch who never went home. The old Kaiser had also asked that no Nazi emblems appear at his funeral. That wish was ignored too. The swastika was there on the day, on the wreaths and the armbands, draped over the farewell of a man who had wanted none of it. The Crown Prince outlived his father by a decade and died in 1951, never restored and never prosecuted, his hopes of a throne buried with the empire that might have granted it. The dynasty had gambled everything on a road back to power. The road led nowhere, but the gamble left a record of letters, of ceremonies, of that day at Potsdam. Half a century later, that record would surface again in a German courtroom to decide what the Hohenzollerns were still owed. When the old Crown Prince died in 1951, the head of the family became the grandson who had once worked Henry Ford's assembly line. Louis Ferdinand inherited a title with almost nothing attached to it. The war had stripped the Hohenzollerns of most of what they still held. Their great estates lay east of the Elbe, in the zone the Soviets occupied, and the new communist authorities seized them in the post-war land reform without a pfennig in return. The dynasty that had filled 59 freight cars in 1920 was, by the 1950s, a family of reduced means and a famous name. For 40 years, the question of what they were owed simply sat there. West Germany had bigger problems, and the lost lands were behind the Iron Curtain and beyond reach. Then the Berlin Wall came down, Germany reunified in 1990, and suddenly those eastern estates, gone for half a century, were inside one country again. In 1994, the German parliament passed a compensation law for families whose property had been seized after the war. The Hohenzollerns, like others, could finally file a claim, and the head of the family duly did. But the 1994 law came with a catch, and the catch had the Crown Prince's name on it. Compensation was barred to any family whose members had given substantial support to the Nazi regime. The lawmakers had written that clause to keep the worst collaborators from being paid by the very state they had helped to wreck. For most claimants it was a formality. For the Hohenzollerns it was the whole case. The man who had led the family through the 1930s was the same prince who had stood in the place of honor at the day of Potsdam. By the time the claim turned serious, the head of the house was Georg Friedrich, a great-great-grandson of the last Kaiser, born in 1976 and bearing a striking resemblance to him. From 2014, he pressed the family's case in earnest. He wanted thousands of artworks returned and a say over the palace contents. He claimed the right to live in one of the old royal palaces near Potsdam, plus compensation running into the millions. The objects, he claimed, were not abstractions. They were the silver, the porcelain, the paintings, much of the very furniture that had once filled the 59 freight cars. The list ran from museum-grade old master paintings down to coffee spoons, an inventory of a vanished court, catalogued item by item. One of Georg Friedrich's requests drew particular scorn. He wanted the right for the family to live again at Cecilienhof, the palace near Potsdam where, in 1945, the victorious Allies had met to settle the shape of post-war Germany. That request, like most of the others, was refused. To settle the claim, the government turned to historians to weigh the old question: had the Crown Prince given the Nazis substantial support or not? The record was not hard to read. In the presidential election of 1932, he had publicly called on Germans to vote for Hitler. He had campaigned for the Nazis, lent them his name and his uniform, and taken the seat of honor at Potsdam. Most of the scholars who reviewed all this concluded that the prince had helped hand the regime its respectability. When the claim became public around 2019, newspapers and politicians asked how the descendants of a man who had backed Hitler could expect the German public to pay them for it. The family did not accept this verdict quietly. Their lawyers argued that the Crown Prince had been a vain, marginal figure with no real influence, a man who flattered Hitler but never shaped events. One of the historians the government consulted agreed the question could not be answered with certainty, but the weight of opinion ran the other way. Georg Friedrich was, in the end, asking the German public to pay him for property lost after the war, while explaining away on camera what his own great-grandfather had done before it. The family had badly misjudged the mood. Faced with mounting public anger and historians lined up against them, the Hohenzollerns began to retreat. In 2023, they withdrew their lawsuits. Quiet negotiations followed, and in May 2025, Germany's culture minister announced a settlement that ended the dispute for good. The furniture that 59 freight cars had carried out of Berlin in 1920 had finally stopped being argued over 105 years later. By then, Germany was on its third system of government since the Kaiser left. The terms told the story of a family that had finally lost. The Hohenzollerns dropped most of their financial demands. Around 27,000 contested objects would stay in public museums, owned not by the family, but by a new charitable foundation. They are the paintings, the furniture, the accumulated treasure of the dynasty, and anyone who buys a ticket can walk in and see them. The Hohenzollerns were given 3 seats on the foundation's 9-member board and no power to veto anything. They kept a short list of minor pieces, among them a handful of antique tobacco boxes. There is a deeper irony buried in the outcome. The Hohenzollerns lost their modest claim not because of 1918 and not because of the communist seizures of 1945, but because of what the Crown Prince had done in between. Their own gamble on Hitler, the bet meant to carry the dynasty back to power, was the very thing that 90 years later cost them the fortune they were chasing. Had the Crown Prince kept the promise to stay out of politics, the lawyers might well have won. Instead, the most damaging witness against Georg Friedrich's case was his own great-grandfather, testifying through the historical record from a church in Potsdam in 1933. The dead prince had undone the living one. You can see how it ended for yourself today. The Prussian imperial crown sits in a glass case at Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin on public display, the property of the German people. The family that wore it lost the throne in November 1918, then spent the next 100 years refusing to call the loss final. They survived exile, a referendum, a ruinous bet on Hitler, and at last, the courts. The crown stayed with the public all the same. Thanks for watching. The republic that took the Hohenzollerns' throne had a short, violent life of its own. It began with this abdication and ended the day Hindenburg handed power to Hitler. To see how it rose and fell, watch next our video on Weimar Germany. Please like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments which story we should cover next.